The preeminent biographer of our times, Caro was born and raised in Manhattan, into the prestigious Horace Mann School. From there, he's admitted choosing Princeton for his parties. And did, or so I was told, actually swiped his wife-to-be from another student at a college dance. Maybe he'll correct me. He also became managing editor of the Daily Princetonian and wrote a record-length senior thesis on an author, ironically best known for tight minimalism, Hemingway. After graduation, Bob stayed in New Jersey, working for the New Brunswick Daily Home News and briefly the Middlesex County Democratic Party, with which the paper was closely connected. But disillusion there finally drove him to Newsday on Long Island, where he found both his métier, investigative reporting, and the subject for his first biography, New York State master builder Robert Moses. Titled The Power Broker, it's been named one of the 100 greatest nonfiction books of the 20th century by the Modern Library and earned Bob's first Pulitzer. The second came, number 2 came from the years of Lyndon Johnson, 4 volumes so far, with a 5th and final installment again underway, now that he's finished the recently published self-analysis of his methods and mindset called Working, copies of which will be for sale and signing here in the back. Bob also has won 2 National Book Awards, one for Lifetime Achievement, the Society of American Historians Francis Parkman Prize, 3 National Book Critics Circle Awards, the H.L. Mencken Award, and a gold medal in biography from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2010, President Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal. Beyond the lofty awards for his unique mixture of unrivaled research and novelistic style, I'm always struck by the infectious passion for his subjects that Bob brings to both his work and to so many interviews about it, including half a dozen from my old Newsweek radio show, for which, again, many thanks. It's a pleasure to have Bob as a friend and his wife Ina as a longtime tennis partner, tomorrow again at 1 p.m. And to have them both here for this chat with you. We will have time for your questions as well, but none about Donald Trump, Bob has requested. So let's begin. I had thought you never actually met Lyndon Johnson, but reading through a small mountain of reviews and interviews, I learned you did once, very briefly, you said. So as you might ask, when, what did you see, what did you hear, and what did you think then of the principal subject of your future life's work?
Well, I didn't know it was going to be this.
It's not on. There's a switch on this mic.
I didn't know he was going to be the future subject of my life. I'm still not on.
1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm going to try again.
Better.
So, I was a substitute political reporter for Newsday in 1964, covering the Johnson Goldwater campaign. The time that David's talking about it, we had started the morning in Washington. We flew to Oklahoma City, and then we flew back and started this tour of New England. When suddenly we got, the campaign got a message that Teddy Kennedy had been in his plane crash and was at the time thought to be on the verge of dying in a Boston hospital, and Lyndon Johnson, who had already been campaigning, was already around midnight, had been campaigning for about 16 hours, said, "We're going to Boston so I can see Teddy Kennedy." So we, as reporters, were all standing around outside the hospital. They came out, and he shook all our hands, and that's the only time, that's the closest I came to meeting him.
I also met Johnson once as a summer intern for United Press, covering his arrival as vice president at Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn. I remember him as huge, overpoweringly confident, and charming while chatting with a line of Army troops. As I was jotting it down in my notebook, he passed by, yanked my hand off the page, shook it, and grinned down at me as if to say, "You're not immune." But from your writing, I learned later that this was arguably the lowest point in Johnson's political life to that point. Suspected, disrespected, and sidelined by John and Robert Kennedy, but also LBJ calculated on the most likely path to a Johnson presidency. So talk about how he dealt with being so diminished from his previous role as Master of the Senate, in your words.
Well, Johnson was the most powerful Democrat in the country. He ran the Senate. We can't even imagine a majority leader running the Senate like Lyndon Johnson. When he became majority leader in January 1955, so you had the days of Webster, Clay, and Calhoun in the 1850s when the Senate was the center of Washington. But then for 100 years, the Senate was basically the same dysfunctional mess that it is today. In fact, the leader before Lyndon Johnson, a senator named Alvin Barkley, said nobody can leave the Senate. I have nothing to promise them. I have nothing to threaten them with. So Johnson becomes majority leader. And people ask what political genius is. Sometimes we can define it as doing something that nobody else was able to do before or since. He becomes majority leader in January 1955. And instantly the Senate becomes the center of governmental energy and ingenuity and creativity in Washington. It's not Eisenhower's civil rights bill, it's Lyndon Johnson's civil rights bill. It's not Eisenhower's minimum wage, it's Lyndon Johnson's minimum wage. He leaves to become Kennedy's vice president. And in 1 week, the Washington Post is saying the Senate is back to being what it was before Lyndon Johnson. That was in 1961 when he left to become Kennedy's vice president. And the Senate from that day to this has been, in my opinion, sort of the same dysfunctional mess. So you say the nature of political genius as Johnson exercised it, that was to do something that no one had ever been able to do before or since. So when he gave that all up to be as being the most powerful Democrat to become the Kennedy's vice president, he realized basically that they had no respect for him at all. They wouldn't even take his advice. When he tried to tell Jack Kennedy how to get a civil rights bill passed, he had to beg Ted Sorensen, who was set up Kennedy's appointments, he had to beg Sorensen for 15 minutes of Kennedy's time to give them advice on how to get the bill passed. They didn't take the advice. They couldn't get it passed. So his 3 years as vice president was a time of complete humiliation for him.
In reading reviews of all your books, I was surprised at how many deemed the early volumes on LBJ something of a hit job, almost always looking for and finding the worst in him, they said. Do you feel that that was the low point of your professional career, and how did you deal with it before big book sales and your second Pulitzer contradicted the critics?
Oh, I never felt that. You know, what it is you're dealing with different episodes, different time periods in his life. Lyndon Johnson was a man with great ambition, great ruthlessness, willingness. He always wanted to be president, and he'd do almost anything to become president, but also great compassion. He always had this desire to help poor people, and particularly poor people of color. So when you're dealing with his early life, the first 2 volumes, you're really dealing with a man who wanted power, didn't have any, and was determined to get it. So to get the picture of him, the accurate picture of this man, is really with interludes of exception where you saw this compassion coming through. That was a very negative time, negative picture of him, if you will, but it was an accurate picture. I always felt it was the same man that I'm writing about. He never changed. It's just, I wrote sometime that power reveals. When someone gets power, you can see what he really is like. You can see what he wanted to do all along, because now he has power and he can do it. And when Johnson becomes president, he does pass the Civil Rights Bill, the Voting Rights Bill, a liberal immigration bill, 70 separate education bills, everything we think of today in education, student loans, student construction money, that all came out of Lyndon Johnson. But basically, it was the same man from beginning to end.
I also think some critics did not initially appreciate the challenge beyond biography that you set yourself with the overall title, The Years of Lyndon Johnson, both the times and circumstances of the country that shaped him, as well as how he later reshaped them. Talk about that part of your mission and what some people think is sort of byways, but are really the context that made Lyndon Johnson who he was and the full story.
Well, that's a very good question. Let me think of this a second. Well, so I never, this will take a second.
That's all right. That's all right. Just hold the microphone closer.
I never thought of my books. I was biography. I never was interested in writing a book just to tell the life of a great man. But I was always, when I was a reporter for Newsday, I covered politics. I started to get a glimpse of what political power could do to people and for people. And I said, that's what I want to write about. I want to write about how political power is accumulated and how it can be used for good and for ill. And I felt that in order to do that, you have to show the effect, not just tell the effect in a few paragraphs, but you have to show the effect of the policies and the actions of the man you're writing about on ordinary people. So, just to take one example of that, in The Power Broker, I have a chapter called 1 Mile. It's about a mile of the Cross Bronx Expressway. So I'm writing about the great highway builder, Robert Moses. You know, Robert Moses built 627 miles of parkways and expressways. If you're driving on an expressway or a parkway or indeed any other major road in and around New York City, you are driving on a road built by one man. So I'm reading all these books on highway building, and they all mention the human cost. Of course, there's a human cost to building a highway. And I remember saying to Ina, I'm never going to write this book about the great highway builder unless I show people what the human cost of highways is. So it took a long time but I say so glibly now, it took a long time to figure out. I finally said, I'm going to do it by taking 1 mile of these highways. I picked the mile of the Cross Bronx Expressway and show what it did to the neighborhood that was there before. That takes a long time to do. That's the time it took really, I said, this is going to take 6 months. You have to interview the people who lived there before. You have to find them and see how being displaced for the highway changed their lives. You have to show what the neighborhood was before, because he's destroying all these neighborhoods to build the highways. But that's sort of what I mean in answer to your question, that I never tried to write a book just on how power was accumulated. I wanted to show how its effect and the potential for political power on people's lives.
When you speak about power, I almost always see it as a force of nature, persuasion, personality. Beginning with Moses, you learned how low down it can actually be. Liquoring up some state legislators during Prohibition, solving another's mortgage problem, threatening to disclose secret adultery. Were you surprised?
No, I was surprised because I had no idea how it worked. If I could say so, there are a bunch of other reporters here. You know, I had won at Newsday a couple of really minor, I'm not kidding, journalistic awards, but whenever I was 23 or 24, and you win anything, you really think you know everything about it. The first time I got to sit down with Robert Moses, which was after a couple of years after I started, because I realized that I was talking to someone whose mind operated on a level that I had never dreamed of. In part, it was this pragmatic side. He remembered everything. I remember once I was asking him something about Jones' speech, and that had been created 40 years before, and without a pause, he said, the vote was 8-7. I can't imitate Robert Moses. He says, the vote was 8-7 against us in Assembly Ways and Means, but the key vote was Stevens of Cattaraugus County, and Stevens had a farm, and the mortgage was held by the Rochester First National Bank, and the way to get to the Rochester First National Bank was so-and-so. And Stevens changed his vote. It was 8-7 for him. But it was also, in each of his offices, Robert Moses had 12 offices because he held 12 jobs at one time. In each of his offices, he had this immense map of New York City, at least as big as that painting. And he'd jump up when you asked him something like a kid, and he was then in his late 70s. And he'd always have several of his aides sitting behind him, and he had a desk full of these. I don't know if anyone here remembers pencils beside him. But they were these little yellow pencils with noise, and he'd go like this, and one of his aides would slap the pencil into his hand. And he'd go over to the map and he'd say, "Can't you see?" But all of a sudden, everything would drop away from what he was talking about. And he'd say, "Can't you see? If I put the highway here, the parks can be here, and the housing can be here." And you suddenly saw that this was a guy who saw this whole metropolitan area, not just New York, but Long Island, Westchester, the edges of New Jersey, as one painting. And he had been filling in lines on this painting for half a century, and he was still doing. So I had to try to show the dreamer, the visionary, this genius. We think of, just, I'm taking too long to answer the question. But, you know, we all think of genius as Picasso in front of a painting, in front of a can with a paintbrush. We think of Beethoven writing out notes. I said, I'm seeing another kind of genius that nobody ever wrote about, the genius of the city shaper. And I have to try to show people that genius.
The key for Johnson early on was persuading some Texas moguls to contribute funds to the Democratic Party that Johnson could personally direct. Talk about what he had done or promised to win over those moguls and how their donations empowered him.
Well, the easiest way to do that is there was this one firm, Brown and Root, and Lyndon Johnson was a congressman, was a federal employee. People in the area didn't really know him, but the congressman died. And the campaign was largely financed by a Texas contracting firm called Brown and Root, whose president was this really tough old guy named Herman Brown. They financed the campaign in large part. Lyndon Johnson got them the contracts to build a federal dam, to complete a federal dam on the lower Colorado River. Later, this went on through all his life, including when he was president. I remember George Brown, who I finally got to talk to after years and years when he wouldn't answer my telephone calls and my letters. I remember him talking about in the Second World War that Johnson got them a contract, the largest federal contract ever given for anything, for to build 342 destroyers, although, as George Brown said to me, I didn't know the stern from the aft.
But Johnson later played a unique, well, we should mention that they gave the money to the party, but it was the understanding that Johnson would decide who in Congress got the money, and suddenly he became a power overnight.
That's right.
But Johnson later played a unique double game. How did he make both fellow Southerners and Northern liberals believe that he was one of them, or would be in a crunch?
Well, Johnson, in fact, George Brown, the same guy, said to me, you know what Lyndon's genius was? Lyndon could make you feel he was on your side, no matter what your side was. And he did this. The most dramatic way of doing this is for 20 years, when he came to Congress and when he was a senator, until 1957, from 1937 to 1957, he made the Southern senators and congressmen believe that he felt the same way they did about black people and where blacks could be kept. I once went to see Herman Talmadge, who was this old Southern senator from Georgia, and he was dying. I've been trying, this is another person I've been trying to see for years, and finally he said he would see me. I heard he was dying, and he was. It was a sort of painful interview, but the crucial thing in line with your question is, I said, why did you support Johnson all those years? He said, because he believed the way I did, or I thought he did. I said, well, how did he do it? He said he spent a lot of time with me. He talked all the time. And he thought the relationship between blacks and whites was the same way. I said, well, what was that? What did he think the relationship was? And he said, master and servant. So I said, so how did you feel when Lyndon Johnson became president after Kennedy's assassination? And he stands, I'll just go back and I'll say, so 4 days after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson has to address a joint session of Congress. He still isn't in the White House in the Oval Office yet. He's still living in his home. Downstairs in the kitchen, 4 of his speechwriters are around the kitchen table writing his speech. He comes down in his bathrobe suddenly around midnight, and he says, well, what do you got for me? And they basically say, we can't agree on it very much. The only thing we agree on is that you can't mention civil rights. You certainly can't make civil rights a priority. Kennedy tried to make civil rights a priority, and as a result, the Southerners who controlled Congress stopped his entire legislative program. If you make civil rights a priority, they're going to do the same thing to you. So he gets up, and at this speech he says, our first priority must be to pass Jack Kennedy's civil rights program. When you see on a newsreel this speech, you see the Southern senators, many of them in their white suits, are seated in this row right in front of them. So I asked Herman Talmadge, how did you feel when you heard those words, civil rights must be a priority? And he said, sick. So Johnson, who would later become the greatest civil rights president, made people believe for 20 years that he felt the opposite way that he really did.
That's undercover work.
That's true.
Of course, everybody mentions LBJ's size. How big a factor was it in his political career? Could he have succeeded on personality and savvy alone if it was short as Mayor Pete?
Well, David, I want to tell you, you ask good questions, but that's a question I've never been asked before.
We've never had a presidential candidate
As Mayor. Well, Lyndon Johnson was very big. He was just a shade under 6'4". His weight we don't know because his weight was the most closely guarded secret. But he was huge, and of course he had this habit of putting his arm around you and with his other hand taking your lapel and pulling you into him so this big face was bent over you. It was the very definition of invading your face. And he used his size effectively.
Let's talk research. How does live interviewing compare for you with the delight you report in finding, holding, reading key documents, turning every page?
Well, well, they're both fun. You know, I happen to sort of be a masochist. I like both of them. I like going through papers and I like doing interviews. And you know, sometimes you get wonderful insights from interviews. I'll tell you just one thing. So John, I don't know how many people here remember the name John Connolly. John Connolly was governor of Texas, and he was Nixon's Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of the Navy. So the first 2 books, as David said, the Johnson people, not critics so much, but the Johnson people were really attacking those books. But I didn't really care about the attacks, except that John Connolly was attacking them. He not only was reviewing the books unfavorably, but he did op-ed pieces attacking me. And the reason his criticism really bothered me was that I knew that during this period when Johnson was young, John Connolly was closer to Johnson than anybody else. He was his top assistant, but they were really more than congressman and assistant. They were very close. And I was thinking maybe I was wrong if he's attacking me. All the time I had been working on those books, which let's say was 12 years or so, I would write Connolly letters. He'd never reply. I'd call. His secretary would always say they'd give him the message, but he never called back. All of a sudden, after the second book has come out, we had a mutual friend, a woman who was the Washington bureau chief of the Dallas Times-Herald, named Margaret Meyer, the first woman to be the head of a Washington bureau of a major newspaper. And she calls me one day and she said, you know, I was at a dinner party last night and the governor came. They still called him the governor in Florida and everywhere. All Texans called him the governor until he died. He said, I was at a dinner party last night. The governor came and he was carrying your first volume. And you know something? He says he likes the book, you know. So I took that with a grain of salt. But a couple of weeks later, she calls and said, I was at another dinner party. The governor came in and said, he finished your book. He really loves it. So I resisted the temptation to say, I'm sorry he didn't read it before he criticized it. But a couple of days later, the phone rings in my office, and I pick it up, and this voice says, Mr. K, I can't do the Texas accent. Caro has 4 syllables to it. But it said something like, Mr. Caro, this is John Conley. So I said, oh, hello, Governor. You know, he said, I really liked your books. There's only one thing that bothers me. I said, what was that? He said, you never tried to talk to me. So I said, well, I'd like to talk to you, or something like that. I don't know what I said. He said, so I'll send a plane. So I said, well, that's all right, I can fly down. He had a ranch, a huge ranch, a palace of a ranch, really, down in the very poor, down near the Mexican border, a place called Prose. And he said, if you come down there, I promise you there's no question that I won't answer. And in fact, I went down there, and for 4 days, John, who was growing up on a ranch himself, would wake me up at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, and we'd go. He then had a whole stable of quarter horses. And you either sit on the fence next to where they were exercised, the Mexican vaqueros were exercising his horses. You'd either sit on the top railing, or you'd sit in, sometimes they bring out lawn chairs, and he would talk from morning to night about Lyndon Johnson. And in fact, although there was one question, only one question in 4 days that he wouldn't answer. Now you say, and what was that question? And the question was, what did Lyndon Johnson say about Bobby Kennedy?
As a reporter, I feel I often talk too much, too eager to show how much I know to get more from my sources, like right now. You stress the importance of silence as employed by characters of George Simenon, John le Carré. Talk about that and all the letters SU in your notes.
The letters SU stand for shut up. I talk too much, and David's right. You learn that silence is the great weapon because people feel they have to fill it. So if you ask a question and they don't want to answer, sometimes the best thing you can do is to shut up, just wait until they say something.
In fact, there was one interview about LBJ in which you never asked a single question of your source, didn't even look up from your notebook at her.
Well, David is talking about my interview with Lady Bird Johnson. So for a time, near the beginning of the books, Lady Bird was tremendously helpful to me. She used to have these big desk calendars, day by day on your desk that people used to have. What she'd do is she'd go through a year at a time with me, and she'd take out a desk calendar from 1939 or 1940. She said, oh, I see we had dinner at Hall's Restaurant with Sam Rayburn. I remember that dinner. We talked at that dinner. So she was just great. At the same time, I was sort of learning about one of Lyndon Johnson. Now, I had decided Lyndon Johnson was a guy who had a lot of one-night stands or a lot of sexual things with his secretaries, but I determined not to write about that because they didn't seem to me to have anything to do with his political life or what he did in government. But sometime during the years I was working on this, I learned about one woman, a mistress of his, that I felt I had to write about. Her name was Alice Glass, and the reason I felt I had to write about her was that she was a small town girl from a town called Marlin in Texas, but she was also a great beauty, a great society photographer of the 1930s, a man named Orno Gente, sort of the Abaddon at that time, said she was the most beautiful woman he had ever photographed. But she was also noted for her political wisdom. She was a person that politicians came to ask for her opinion on things. And there were times in Johnson's life, several times, in which her opinion was the only opinion he wanted, and it was the opinion he followed. For example, during the war in 1942, he's out in Australia, so you're only allowed one telephone call. And he had been told by Franklin Roosevelt, because Roosevelt looked on him as sort of a protege, if he ever had needed any advice or any help, he could call Roosevelt. He could call him, Franklin Roosevelt. But he doesn't use that one call to call Roosevelt. He uses the one call to call Alice Glass, because the senior senator from Texas, Morris Shepard, had just died. He has to decide, it's 1942, is he going to run to succeed Shepard, or is he going to run again for Congress? The only call he makes, they ask that question, is to Alice Glass. How do I know that? Because in the Johnson Library, I found her telegram back to him with the advice. It says, Lyndon, everybody else, by which she meant the White House, Roosevelt, everybody else thinks you should run for senator. I think you should run for House. And we know what he did. He ran for the House. So I had to find out about her and make her a character in the book. And in doing that, Ina and I had to go to her little town, Marlin, and talk to her sister and all her friends and all. And one day I'm sitting in the Johnson Library, and Lady Bird Johnson's secretary comes over to me and says, I had been interviewing her in her office in the library. She said, Mrs. Johnson would like to see you this Saturday out at the ranch. So I went out to the ranch, and her friend from Marlin had called me and said, Bob, Bird, in Texas they call Lady Bird Bird. Bird knows you've been to Marlin, so she knows that you know about Alice, because there's no reason you would actually go to Marlin unless it was to find out about Alice. But I went out there, and we almost immediately sat down for lunch. This is what David was talking about. And we were at a long table. She was sitting at the head, and I was sitting at the right with my stenographer's notebook down here. And she, without a word of prompting or anything, she starts to talk about Alice Glass in the words that I quote in the book, about the influence, how she was the most beautiful woman she, Lady Bird, had ever seen, how she wore the most elegant dresses, how I could never dress like that, how she taught Lyndon these lessons that he learned, he followed all his life, how he had long, ungainly arms, so she taught him that she should always wear shirts with French cuffs and cufflinks, so his wrists would look good instead of being ungainly. Various other things, how he should always wear Countess Maritais, so for the rest of his life he only wore Countess Maritais, and political advice. And during that whole time, what David is talking about, it's the only interview I couldn't bring myself to ask one question, or in fact I couldn't even look up at her when she was talking about. I just sat there and took notes.
But the point is, she wanted you to know that she only wanted to say good about this woman.
Yes, why I have never understood.
That way she didn't look like she was being deceived. She looked like she was an assist to the large.
You know, that's a very possible reason.
Talk about the psychological stage. You said to have Johnson's younger brother finally be candid about the relationship between Lyndon and their dad.
Yeah, well, that was really hard to do. So when you found out, so when the book started, when we started doing research, I thought I wouldn't have to do much on his youth and his upbringing, because there have been already, I think, 7 biographies written, and they all had a couple of chapters on his youth. They all portrayed him as sort of a Horatio Alger in the hill country, this popular, charismatic young man whom everybody loved and rose through hard work and popularity. But when I started to, what I did, I said, well, none of these books, I don't have to do much work on his youth. I don't think these books are very, they don't have enough color, enough detail. So what I would do is the Johnson Library was open from 9 to 5 every day. So Ina and I would work in the papers from 9 to 5, and every day at 5 o'clock I'd run out to my car and drive out into the hill country, because Lyndon Johnson died at the age of 64. when we started working, he would have been only 67. So the people who grew up with him, or went to high school with him, or college with him, or formed his first political machine, they were still all there. If his best friend was Truman Fawcett had lived when he was a boy on the other side of the courthouse square. Truman Fawcett was still living on the other side of the courthouse square. His first girlfriend was Kitty Clyde Leonard. She was Kitty Clyde Ross now, but she was still in Johnson City. So you could talk to all of them, and what I was hearing was a very different story about a young man who was noted among his peers, not for his popularity, but for his absolute ruthlessness, his ambition, and his willingness to do anything to get ahead. And I was coming to realize that the key to the way he really was his relationship with his father. And his brother, Sam Houston Johnson, was still alive. So Sam Houston would talk to me all I wanted, and he really would talk to me more than I wanted, because he was a guy who drank a lot, and was full of what we can call bravado, a lot. So most of what he was telling me, we would check it out with other sources, would turn out not to be true. So I felt, boy, I've wasted a lot of my life listening to this guy. I'm not going to talk to him anymore. So then we didn't see each other for about a year. And during that year, I heard that he had had a terrible operation for cancer, and that he had stopped drinking, and that he was a different kind of person. And one day, I was walking along the streets of Johnson City, just walking around there, and there was Sam Houston coming towards me. By this time, he was using a cane. And we went and had a cup of coffee in a cafe there, and I found myself sitting next to a guy who was really very, very different from the man he had been before. And I remember thinking, well, I think maybe it's worthwhile going back and asking him the same questions again, and particularly about the relationship that Lyndon had with his father. So I thought of a way to try and make his memory as clear as possible, to make him remember as accurately as possible. I got the National Park Service had recreated the Johnson home so that Lyndon's sisters said that it looked exactly the way it did while Lyndon and Sam Houston were growing up in it. So I got the National Park Service to agree that I could take him in one day after it had closed for the day and there was nobody else there. And I sat him down at the same place. There was this long, they had dinner every night, the Johnsons, at this long blank table. There was a high-back chair at one end for the father and at the other end for the mother. The three sisters sat on a bench on one side of the table, and Lyndon and Sam Houston sat on a bench on the other side of the table. And I sat Sam Houston down at the same place he had had as a boy. It was dinner time, so even the shadows in the place I felt would be the same shadows that he had felt that had as a boy. I didn't sit where he could see me. I sat behind him. Of course, as I said in the book, I didn't want anyone at that table who wasn't a Johnson. And then I started asking him questions about what dinners were like. At first, it was very slow going, and he would say things like, you know, well, father would say, and I have to say, well, then it would link, but then he would start going faster and faster. And finally, he was really back at that dinner table as he had been as a boy, and he was shouting, Lyndon, you're a failure. You'll always be a failure. But what are you? All you are is a bus inspector. And then I said, so now, Sam Houston, I felt he was really back remembering things accurately. So, Sam Houston, now I want you to go back over all the stories that you told me before and just give me some more details about them. And he said, I can't. I said, why not? He said, because they never happened. And then without any other prompting really, he started telling the story of Lyndon Johnson's life, which is the story that's in my first volume. And this time when I went back to all his friends, who have been involved in these incidents, they said, yes, that's the way it happened.
Other special approaches that aided your reporting, like fig preserves, when you and Ina lived in the Texas Hill Country, to understand how it shaped WJ.
Ina has this genius for getting people to like her and talk to her. It was very hard to get the women of the Hill Country to talk to me because, for one thing, they had lived very isolated lives. You can't even imagine it. I mean, you make an appointment to see some of them, and the directions would be something like you drive out of Austin to 22 miles en route on 95, then you look for the cattle guard and you turn left, and then you might drive for 30 miles on an unpaved, graded road, and at the end of it was a house. And you realize in those 30 miles, you haven't passed the house. So you said these women lived lives of such isolation in New York, you can't even imagine it. So they weren't used to talking to strangers, and they really weren't used to talking to someone from New York City who had a New York accent. But Ina made, but it was a thing. We had 3 fig preserves fig trees on our property. We lived in a house there. And Ina learned how to make fig preserves and would bring jars of fig preserves, and they were instantly my friends.
Ina has also been your not-so-secret weapon when it comes to documents.
Ina is good. Ina wrote in her high school yearbook, Ambition, historical researcher. And I wrote in one of my books, Ina was born for libraries. There's nothing that makes her happier than going to documents.
Bravo, Ina.
Talk about the way some sources notoriously tight-lipped for years. You've given us one example. Just can't bear taking what they know to be very unsaid, and sort of come to you after all those years of not talking and say,
well, it's incredibly dramatic things that happen because in the line of what you're talking about. I got one example, which is a dramatic example. So as David said, the Johnson people really hated it, and that's not too strong a word. They hated the first two volumes. Now they will also seem to come around to like the book. But there was one person, there was his last press secretary. I'll tell this one story. Sure. It was a guy named George Christian. And I had, again, like John Connolly, been writing him letters and leaving telephone messages for decades. And then I heard that George Christian he had lung cancer, he had a round of chemotherapy. They thought he was better. Then it came back. And this time I heard he had decided he didn't want to go through the chemotherapy again, and he decided to just let himself die. And just about the time that I heard that, I get a call from him saying, he said, I think these are the exact words. He says, well, Mr. Caro, I guess it's time I guess it's time we sat down and talked. So I flew down to Boston. He was in this very powerful lobbyist. His office suite, there was a whole glass window that overlooked the state capitol. And the first interview we had, he had an oxygen tank in the corner of his office and a mask on his desk. But he really, as I recall, I don't think he had to use it more than once or twice, very, very little. Second time, he used it a lot. In the third interview, he'd only talked to me for about an hour or so, and then he just said, well, I guess you're going to have to get the rest from somebody else. And he called for his driver and to take him home, and about 2 weeks later, just dead. But he was a great, he again provided some insight into his last year as president on Vietnam that I couldn't have gotten from anyone else but him.
We talked about some of the methods that using in the Johnson home, the fig preserves. I'm impressed by how important and successful you are in getting the same sources over and over again? I mean, you say there's really, I mean, some of us worked in this job for years, and, you know, if we got 15 minutes with somebody, we thought we were lucky. You've been really persistent. I mean, a dozen times that people will say, Caro, you've asked me this before, but what is the magic that produces?
Well, there isn't any magic, you know. If there's someone important, if you say to them, you say, you know, if they don't understand, sometimes they'll tell you an anecdote, you know, but it's just the words. So you want to be able to write a scene that people can read and see. The hardest thing sometimes is to get them to really tell you what the scene looked like. So I think I say, I forget what I said, if I wrote this in the book, I say, well, if I was standing next to you, what would I be seeing? What would I be seeing? And you know, they do get, as you said, they get really annoyed. I mean, I hear you asked me that before, over and over again. But sometimes if you do it over and over again, angry as they get, it really produces great gems. One example, which is in my mind, because I just wrote this scene in the book I'm writing now, was with Joe Califano, who was Johnson's chief domestic advisor. And he would talk to me about how Johnson he couldn't wait for the news. So what he did was he had built into the Oval Office 3 teletype tickers. We had then the Associated Press, the United Press, and INS, not Reuters. And there were 3 tickers constantly going. So Califano had mentioned to me how Johnson would always go up, jump up and look at the tickers, you know. And I kept saying, so how exactly did he do that? What would I see? And he would say something like, I told you already. He got up from the desk, he walked over to the tickets, and he looked at them. But I would ask him, I had something like 12 interviews with Califano. Every interview, I would ask that, and he would get annoyed. And finally, I said, listen, what do you mean? And he would get up. Or he would jump up, you know how he would jump up from the desk, and he'd walk over to the tickers, and he'd open because to make them less noisy, he had a cover on them, and he'd pull open the cover. And I said, okay, and then what? He said, what do you mean? He'd pull open the cover. I said, how would he pull over the cover? And he said, oh, you know, I forgot that. Sometimes he was so anxious to see what the guy was writing that he'd stoop down and put both hands on the paper as if he could pull it out of the ticker, as if he could get the news a moment faster. So that's an example of, if you don't mind people getting angry at you.
A Pulitzer Prize helps. But I was working at UPI one night, and the phone rang, and it was Johnson. He had just read something on the ticker, and he called the national desk at UPI, and he held through.
You never told me that. What will I find out?
There's so much. Moses seemed pretty callous to the pain and suffering that his undeniably wondrous web of construction caused. Communities destroyed, as you said, thousands of low-income residents displaced. It seemed to me, as I read that it was a stark contrast to the tape recordings in which we hear LBJ so agonized over the blood and treasure lost in Vietnam. Is that a defining difference in their characters?
Oh, that's a terrific question. Yes. Moses, yes, Johnson really felt. Moses was a man who was very hard to describe among any other. He was the most callous man, most racist man. I mean, the callousness, one time I talk about all the 50,000 residents he displaced, threw out of their homes. They spent the rest of their lives in loneliness in Co-op City, or living with their kids, where they had a neighborhood before. And I remember I once asked him, you know, what he felt about the fight they had tried to put up to save their neighborhood, and he just said, whatever the quote he said, oh, they just stirred the animals up a bit. They just stirred up the animals up there, so I just held fast. He was the most racist man I've ever encountered. I remember him one time, he only had one telephone on his desk because he was more powerful than any mayor or any governor. So if a mayor or governor or anyone else wanted to get him, they had to wait till he was done with the call that he was on. And the phone rings. I never knew who was on the other end, although from the conversation, I believe it was a mayor asking to do something. At the end of it, he slammed down the phone and said, they expect me to build playgrounds for that scum floating up from Puerto Rico. And he meant every word of it. There was a great differences between Robert Moses and Lyndon Johnson.
There's a chapter in Working called Two Songs. For you, the anthem, We Shall Overcome, embodied the first hopeful half of the 1960s under Johnson, civil rights, great society. When LBJ himself heard those words, you learned it made Martin Luther King cry, the first time his aides had ever seen him in tears. But the second half, Vietnam, it was a lesser-known Pete Seeger song, Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. How does it reflect your view of LBJ and the Vietnam War?
Well, it doesn't reflect my view exactly, but you do sometimes wonder, and I tell you, I'm writing about that now.
Oh.
So can I take a pass?
Sure. All right, I want to talk a little bit about
Whenever you're going off on a digression like what happened to the people of East Tremont, to what the women of the Hill Country would like before he brought electricity, you can always think, how is this relating back to the theme, this little theme that's the center of the book? Is it reflecting back? And it sort of keeps you on track. It's as you're doing it, I mean, Heiner would say, you don't want to talk to Bob while he's doing that, because it's not easy to do. But I found everything you make it sound like I know what I'm doing. Everything that I'm talking about, you learn as you go along. And then I learned out of desperation, because I said, these books are so big, how do I keep it on theme? And that's the way I do it.
You estimate your daily output in lines of typewriter text as you did at Newsday, as many of us did at Newsweek. But your prose itself has come a long way from daily journalism, being now both famous and infamous for its seductively serpentine complexity. In a single sentence, one could have counted, quote, and others quote, 153 words, 12 commas, 2 dashes, 1 set of parentheses, 1 set of brackets, 3 sets of quotation marks, 1 colon, and 2 semicolons. So talk about how and why you developed this post-journalistic style and how it fits into your feeling for the necessity of rhythm and mood in each sentence that you write.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I knew there'd be no answer.
I always wrote long sentences. When I was at Newsday, they were always putting periods in.
All right, there are more questions I'd like to ask about writing, but I see it's getting a little late. So let me bring to the last segment. We agreed that you would not talk about Donald Trump, but let's talk about about politics in general. About the conditions that Trump and others, mainly conservatives, have exploited. Some say even Johnson could be Johnson in today's vicious politics of personality, the power of celebrity, very weakened political parties, pervasive, very provocative social media, dark money, disdain for actual, factual, quote, fake news, deep ideological divisions, even hints of civil war. Could LBJ succeed today?
Oh, that's a very good question. The answer, but I'll elaborate on it, is yes, but we would do it in a different way. The nature of political genius, which is very rare, is, as I said earlier, that you figure out how to do something that no one else has done before. Robert Moses wanted to be mayor, he wanted to be governor. people got a look at his personality. He realized he once ran for governor. He lost by what is still the largest majority anybody ever lost by in a statewide election in New York State. He realized he was never going to be mayor, never going to be governor. He wanted to build all these roads and bridges. How was he going to get the power to do it? He goes into, because he was a genius, his mind was a genius. He went into a little room with a yellow legal pad, and he wrote the legislation creating the public authority in the form we know it now. Where he then turns this into legislation that has to be passed by the legislature. The first 40 pages say a public authority is nothing but sells bonds to build a bridge or some other public works. It collects tolls to pay off the bonds, and then it goes out of existence, okay? On page 41, there's a paragraph that basically says, but it's hard to understand it, but this is what it says, but the public authority can always roll over the bonds for another 40 years. And that's the next paragraph, and says that the chairman of the public authority or the sole member of the public authority will always be me. So that gave him the power to create New York in the mold that we all live in. Lyndon Johnson, I mentioned before, on the Senate, the leader before him said, I have nothing to promise them, I have nothing to threaten them with. Lyndon Johnson, as soon as he becomes leader, he tries to figure out what he can promise them and what he can threaten them with. And even when I was learning about this and writing about it, I said, this is just genius. The one thing you couldn't ever change in the Senate is the seniority system. Everybody is appointed to committees by seniority. Therefore, the leader has no power. All he does is assign people by seniority. He goes to the other elders in the Democratic Party and says, listen, we have this great talker, Hubert Humphrey. We don't want to waste him on so-and-so. We have this senator. We don't want to waste him on so-and-so. Let me appoint the best men. They don't realize what's happening, but all of a sudden the leader is appointing. So he finds, I think, 21 different ways of creating power in the Senate that no one had thought of before. So when you say, would a genius come along today? Yes. But it'll be a different kind of genius.
All right, let's forget Johnson and Trump. Do you worry, given all of these trends, if democracy as we know it can survive?
Yes, I think it's, without going into any, and this, well, I'll just end on this note, okay? So what will Trump be? Will he be an outlier? Someone that we never had anyone before or since like him? Or will he be like the first of the mad Roman emperors, where he was the first of the line of Nero, Caligula, etc., and the whole nature of Rome changed? We don't know that yet. We may find out in the next election.
Wow, okay. I was going to ask what key questions I had not asked that you'd like to answer, but I think we'll, with the few minutes that we have, open the floor with the understanding, as Rob said, that he doesn't want to talk about Trump in particular. So, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Caro, very much. David Halliburton, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, was in the room when Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson was meeting with Senate Minority Leader Edward Dirksen from Illinois, and there were 5 or 6 other senators and staff in the room. And Dirksen had to leave the room, Halliburton testified, to go to a Republican caucus, and when he left the room, LBJ said, that boy couldn't find his fanny with both hands. How does that fit in with LBJ's magic? I mean, he said it in front of witnesses and recording.
I don't really know exactly. He was very good at summing up his opinion of people in a sentence, in a vivid sentence.
Short answer.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Without getting political, where do you think the American dream is going right now with social media impacting everything we're doing every minute?
Where do I think I think we're going to find out maybe next year where it's going.
So it's up to the electorate.
Yes.
Were you involved in the terrific new Edward Norton film, Motherless Brooklyn?
No.
Well, everyone will think of you the whole time they watch it, because there's one moment where they say the power broker, but it is so. Have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Tomorrow.
Okay.
Well, let me follow that up. There was a screening in Sag Harbor of All the Way, which is the play and the movie about LBJ and civil rights. And the guy who wrote and directed, Schenken, said he was very disappointed that you had never come to see it. And I told him not to take it personally because what you've said about keeping fiction and fact separate. So talk about why you don't go and see things like that.
Well, that's easy to explain. It's so hard. It was so hard for me to get in my mind a picture of Lyndon Johnson based on reality and what people told me. So I finally got him fixed in my mind as close to reality as possible. So if a bad actor was playing him, it wouldn't much matter, but the guy who played Lyndon Johnson in All the Way was really good. I didn't want to see somebody else. I didn't want to have him in my mind.
A couple more? Yes, sir.
Please discuss the complicated relationship over that 20-year period between Lyndon Johnson and Hubert Humphrey through the Senate, the Vice Presidency, and the candidacy for President 68.
Well, that's a really, there are parts of Johnson's story that are really hard to write about. They're hard to learn about because there was this great streak of compassion in him and a great streak of cruelty in him. And he exercised this on Hubert Humphrey. When he was in power in the Senate, Humphrey becomes a freshman senator. Johnson takes him under his wing and boosts him to power, then makes him his vice president. But part of the reason that he does this is that he sees that he can dominate Humphrey. And as soon as Humphrey is elected as vice president, he begins to humiliate him. And he does it the very day. Humphrey comes down to his ranch the day after the election. And he's never ridden a horse, Humphrey. Johnson makes him say, oh, you have to wear ranch clothes. So he was much bigger than Humphrey. So Humphrey is in this hat that's too big. Then he puts him on a horse that's not a docile horse. And Humphrey is humiliated, throwing all the cameras is flashing. So it's a very, very, one of the really sad stories. There are a lot of really sad stories revolving around Lyndon Johnson. And Humphrey, to me, it's a story you could cry when you're writing about. Just a few more.
Yeah.
You talked about people coming around.
Louder.
You talked about people kind of coming around towards the end of their lives. Did Robert Moses ever switch his opinions on race?
On race?
And was there a shift at the end of his life?
No, I don't. So, I mean, I didn't see him.
In fact, tell him that you asked one question. I mean, you were having a series of meetings, and there was one question that ended your entree ever after.
Yeah, well, so when I started to do this book, there had never been a biography. There was only one biography of Robert Moses. It was like a puff job done by a guy who was literally on his staff. But many writers had tried to write biographies, famous biographies, and everyone had been stopped, had given up, because I suppose they were told what I was told. I mean, his PR man came, he said, the commissioner, they all told him, the commissioner will never talk to you, his family will never talk to you, his friends will never talk to you, and you'll never get to see his papers, So I nevertheless, I decided to do it anyway, and after about 2 years, he did agree to see me. I had 7 interviews with him. They weren't really interviews because you'd ask him a question and he might talk for an hour or two. But I didn't mind that because, as I said before, it was like listening to a genius who was telling you, oh, can I tell you what Robert Moses looked like when you were interviewing him? So beyond Jones Beach, there's a little summer colony called Hope Beach. He had it's a modest colony. He had the last cottage in the corner. And he had torn out of the living room 2 walls so there were just windows. Out of the left-hand wall, you saw Robert Moses Causeway, the Robert Moses Bridge, out of to Fire Oil. On the right hand, you saw the tower of Robert Moses State Park. He sat in the corner of this big black chair, so it's Robert Moses framed by his monument. So we had 7 interviews. I didn't ask him. There weren't a lot of questions. He would talk. These interviews sometimes would go on. I remember once he got there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we had to go to a friend's bar mitzvah, was the evening bar mitzvah, and I missed the bar mitzvah because he had talked all day. But I finally had a lot of the stuff that he was telling me, didn't comport with the record as I was getting it from written sources. And there came a time when I just had to try to resolve the differences, and there was one thing in particular I wanted to know about, which involved a robber baron from the 1920s named Otto Kahn, a very wealthy man. And Robert Moses had shifted the route of the Northern State Parkway south so it would miss, it would have run across Otto Kahn's private 18-hole golf course. And as a result of that, 23 small farmers were ruined. And this was kept secret. No word of this ever appeared anywhere, but I found a telegram in Al Smith, in the papers of Al Smith, the governor at the time, which referred to this and gave me enough so I could look at other papers, and I got at the story I just basically told you. So I worded this question as circumspectly as I could, but Robert Moses was a lot smarter than I was. And the minute the words Otto Kahn came out of my mouth, I saw his eyes change. And not long after that, he said, well, that'll be enough for today. And I never got to see him again.
Well, Bob, it's been... one more, I'm sorry. Well, yes.
When you writing about the Cross Bronx Expressway and the displaced persons, how did you get into the mode of speaking to people who grew up a very, very different way from you? And did you just come in as this Manhattanite interviewing them, or how did you relate to these people?
Well, it was a Jewish neighborhood. I'm Jewish. We're all New Yorkers. I didn't have that. Texas was a real problem because I was different from them. And, they knew it.
No, actually, this brings me to the last question. You say you're Jewish. Given the effort you put into getting LBJ and his father right, I'd like to ask you how your family affected you and your work, which was quite different from the antagonism of Johnson, Pear, and Feast. In fact, you told me in a conversation once that you practically raised yourself.
Well, just to do it very briefly, my mother died when I was 11. She got very sick when I was 5, and my father was quite elderly when he had me.
Didn't speak a lot of English, I think you said.
But Yiddish was really, I mean, he spoke English, but Yiddish was really his language. So, in that respect, it wasn't like short.
Okay, enough said. It's been daunting, as I say, but a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking with us today.